Okay, well, what I'm going to talk about today, I'm sorry about the resolution, but there's quite a lot of slides. All the nice picture slides, I'm afraid you've had all those from Jenny, so mine's a lot of text, but hopefully we can cope with it. And what I'm going to be talking about today is, you see the subheading of this, the importance of space for intentional communities, is what I'm going to draw out. As a human geographer, perhaps you'd expect that, but that's very much the essence of what I'm about today. And I want to place the talk today in terms of thinking about the different factors that can be said to create a more successful examples of intentional communities. Now, clearly, we could debate at length what you mean by successful, which is why I put it in quotes there, and I don't want to get onto that, but just to think about the different factors that might feed into that. And so what typically stressed, well, first of all, people will talk about things like, well, the membership of the group, you know, the motivations of the people. Are they being realistic? Are they being idealistic, etc., etc.? What are their ambitions? What are the practices? Are they actually practicing what they preach in their activities? You know, is it all sort of coming together nicely? Is there sort of discipline in the community? We heard about discipline of hierarchical discipline just now. Is there discipline in the community to get things done the way it wants to be? So that's you know, there's a lot of research on that sort of area. Secondly, the importance of the socio-cultural, socio-political context is important. It's often talk about, you know, different types of intentional communities evolving in different times in terms of the economy. When the economy is buoyant, often more experimentation takes place. Or you might argue the contrast when in economically depressed times, different intentional communities come into their own. Culture is important, of course. Is there a sort of culture that sort of supports or negates or tries to sort of squash innovation, individual ideas, etc. The legal framework, of course, very important. You know, we've already heard a lot about the importance of the legal framework there today already. Thirdly, you get the importance of the historical emplacement of intentional communities. You know, the times they emerge in. There are times in history where more sort of radical experimentation, for example, and ways of living tend to be more favoured than at other times. I mean, a classic historical example, of course, is during the English Civil War when the sort of state collapsed and lots of very radical ideas were tried out and experimented with in the chaos, interesting chaos of those times. And then fourthly, and what I'm going to focus on, it is in bold, but you can't barely see it, is the importance of geographical context, a spatial context in which intentional communities develop and do their thing. And in terms of the importance of spaces to these communities, again, these are categories that are not mutually exclusive, which again is why I put them in sort of in quote marks there. You get the importance of the internal spatiality of the community, and we've already heard quite a lot about that, I think, and certainly in Jenny's book, which is definitely a good read. So make sure you buy a copy. I don't get any royalties, but I just want to plug it. That's seen as increasingly recognised as important. But also in terms of what I call there the external geography, external spatiality of these communities, how these communities fit in the areas, the places that they are part of. They're entangled with other people, other places, other ideas in particular locations. And that, I think, is really important. And so how people work within the communities, how they deal with existing spaces, how they modify them, adapt them, and how particularly they create or produce, as I'll say later on, their own spaces is a critical concern. So the talk, the main bit of the talk has got three bits. First of all, I'm going to introduce what I call trial by space. Oh, I don't call it that. The person I'll talk about in a minute does. And then I'll look at how that is apparent in terms of what I'm calling sort of back to land movements in the 1970s and the present day, contrasting the rural context of a lot of these, and that's my case studies are very much about sort of rural, sort of back to land type movements. And then there's a short sort of conclusion at the end there. So to give you a bit of a context. And don't worry, most of the slides are not quite as crammed with text as this one. I know it's very bad to have too much text on a slide, but you've got to sort of break your own rules occasionally. It's all part of the thing, really, isn't it? So much of what I talk about today is inspired very much by the late French theorist, Henri Lefebvre. You see his dates there, 1901 to 1991. And in particular, the book, The Production of Space, which, as you can see, well, it was written in the 1970s, was translated into English in fact, the year that Lefebvre died there. Those of you who don't know much about him, very famous as a sort of a Marxist French urban theorist, but I think if you look more deeply, he has a very interesting sort of background in sort of rural sociology and the changing countryside in a lot of his early work. And he wrote about all sorts of things that us geographers find extremely interesting. But he was one of the inspirations for the things like the groups like the Situationists in the 1960s, in the sort of the events in Paris in '68 and what have you. Okay, well, within the production of space, and this is by far the longest quote, though it's heavily edited. I haven't put the dots in, but I've done a good job of editing it down. He talks about his concept of trial by space, and this is a key sort of concept for you all today. And he talks about how nothing or no one can avoid trial by space. It's in space that each idea of value acquires or loses its distinctiveness through confrontation with other values and ideas that it encounters there. Groups cannot constitute themselves unless they produce a space. Ideas, representations or values which do not succeed in producing an appropriate morphology will lose all pith and become mere signs, resolve themselves into abstract descriptions or mutate into fantasies. And that idea is really central, I think, to so much of Lefebvre's work. That idea that if you're going to sort of carry on with a set of ideas and new types of spaces that represent them, you've got to be able to sort of pass this trial by space, as he put it. But, first of all then, what do we mean by space? Geographers talk about space all the time, and many geographers have written many books and articles about them, and don't worry, I'm not going to be reviewing all that here. That's far too much. But I just want to introduce here a model of space, and it's illustrated here with respect to rural space, because that's from one of my papers, and I just cut and paste it. But if you took out the word rural there, the model, I think, would still be appropriate. And it's a development, not a drastically radical development, but it's a development of Lefebvre's own threefold idea of what space is about. And he argues that spaces always have these three elements to them. First, they can be seen, if they just as localities. These are the spaces that we can perceive. They're very much written, inscribed through relatively distinct activities and practices. So if we think of rural space, for example, we'd almost certainly talk about farming practices there. They're things you can see. You can see the farmers in the fields and whatever, and you can measure what they're doing, you can measure their outputs. All those sorts of elements comprise the locality. Secondly, we have what I'm calling there formal representations of space. This is much more the conceived idea of space. I was thinking about this morning. It's like, imagine you lock a load of people in a sort of room with no windows, and you get them to talk about, say, the rural, what the construction they create of what rurality, for example, is about, or an urban space is about. That's the idea of representations of space, expressions of different interests, stakeholders, politicians, for example, or different groups, different ethnic groups, different genders, different classes in society, their expressions, conceptions of space. And then thirdly, Lefebvre and myself, we talk about the sort of third term that's brought in there, is the idea of lived spaces, of everyday lives, spaces as everyday lived. And these are the spaces that we all have, the meanings we all have. So thinking about the countryside, yes, we may recognise the practices going on, the farming, what have you. We may have a very clear idea what we think rural areas are about. We have our representations. But for us, a particular rural area might have its very own individual meanings. It was a place we came on holiday. It's a place we like to go to walk. A place we can sort of separate ourselves out from the hurly-burly of exam marking and all that sort of stuff, etc., etc. It's a very individual sense of space. And that can be taken at a quite subversive level, which is the sort of area that Lefebvre himself was very keen to develop. Now, crucially, all three of these elements, they interrelate, they interact with each other. They can't be sort of thought of really independently. Put it crudely, they influence each other, they're influenced by one another. So they always should be seen active together. So, in a successful trial by space, you might say, if you're going to, the sort of starting point really is that you need a relative degree of coherence in terms of your spatiality. You have to have a sense of the locality, that coincides more or less with the representations that is likely to be sort of reflected in the more individualistic sort of style of things. The three things have to in many ways cohere to enable them to be sort of reproduced, to enable those spaces to be reproduced. But of course, you can have your intentional communities, you think about that, they have a particular idea of the space, how they're going to do things, what have you. But of course, they never exist in sort of isolation. There's always other spaces, other things going on there. Much more sort of dominant, you might argue, spatialities at play. And so you've got to think about how, for example, the spaces of the intentional communities interact and connect to those other spaces there. And these are other spaces that are both internal, and say you're taking intentional communities go into a property, they're not building it themselves like Jenny's, but they're taking over one. How do they deal with those internal spaces? But also how do they deal with other spaces around them in terms of the more external idea of spatiality? And so as Jenny puts it there in her book, eco-homes are a product of the socio-economic, and I've emphasised geographical and political environments in which they're built. So I'm going to focus on those geographical environments, in particular with reference to more back to the land, particularly in the UK context. So, as I say, a lot of the ideas hopefully can be expanded into other areas. So how do back to the land deal with changing trial by space? Very quickly, what I mean by back to the land intentional communities, obviously the more individual examples as well, is attempts sort of hitting those three bullet points, broadly speaking, attempts of people to do sort of more sort of land-based work, typically sort of farming or farming type activities at a sort of fairly small holding, small scale level. Usually there's a degree of food self-sufficiency intended there. It's meant to be more independent, more autonomous. And within these sorts of activities, these experiments, there's a broadly sort of green ethics, as I put it there, centres relationships between the people involved and other humans and other sort of non-human actors in the sort of I call there a land working network. So it's about really centring your interconnectivity, your place in the sort of ecosystem of life. Now, clearly that type of intentional community was very much a key part of the sort of 1960s, 1970s counterculture. Very good books by Andrew Rigby from the 1970s. Many of them were urban examples, but within that there's very clear sort of rural back to the land case studies there. And of course there's a huge literature on them, or more bigger literature on this, actually not as big as you might think, in the United States, for example, North America, but there's some here. And that was a key element of that. Similarly today, there's been something of a revival that I've argued, and people like Chris Coates have argued, but a revival in some of these, this attempt to try to sort of reconnect with the land. We see it through things like low impact developments and what have you. So what I'm going to do now is to sort of talk about those two brief periods. I'll talk about the 70s and the present day, and to think about, well, how do these communities, how do they fit in their spatialities, in the sort of spatialities of the British countryside, and I'm focusing very much on that. It could be the European countryside, but these are, I should say, British countryside of the times. So how did they sort of fit or not fit in that sort of context? So this is importance then of the sort of external geographical context. Now the first group, the 1970s back to the land, can be related to what we call in the sort of in the rural, what some of us call in the rural literature, the productivist countryside. The attempts in the sort of post-war years, particularly after the experience of World War II, to try to sort of, in many ways, reconstruct the countryside as very much this sort of very much dominated by agriculture and other primary production, but particularly agriculture. Seeing agriculture not as the sort of problematic state that was in the 1930s, but instead as a sort of progressive, expanding sort of food industry, but hopefully fitting within, this is where some of the tensions lay, which I can't really talk about here, within a sort of an existing type of landscape. Now that idea, a hegemonic sort of dominance of a particular model of agriculture, the back to the land movements of the 70s had to sort of somehow to relate to that, or challenge it, relate to it, but it was there. It was a reality in rural areas at the time. So what I'm going to look at then is some of the barriers in brackets and opportunities that context, that spatial context, that broader spatial context provided at the time. So if we look at sort of localities, well, it's a mixed picture, as they all are, as you'll see. First of all, this was the period still where rural depopulation, was very much going on in the countryside. So the loss of labour from agriculture, it's still going today, but it was very, very noted then, and affiliated industries and things, businesses shutting. Population in the countryside was depopulating still at that period, before the sort of counter-urban trends started really to develop from the sort of late 60s there. And so the idea, the drift from the land is that idea capturing that sort of sense. Now, clearly, moving back to try to do something different was really going against that sort of trend that could be measured very much by population. So it's a very sort of strange thing to do from that point of view. So that's, you might say, is a sort of barrier. On the other hand, the fact that people were leaving the countryside still dominantly those days meant that quite a lot of properties, so they may have been run down and what have you, were available at that time at relatively sort of reasonable prices. Land wasn't so much, because that was being consolidated into larger farms and what have you, but houses were available, and we see this in some of the properties these back to the land experiments took on, quite big properties that were worth absolute fortune today. Thirdly, if you measured what was going on in localities, agricultural work was still very much dominant, so people trying to engage with that sort of thing, that wasn't unusual, so that would fit. That's the sort of opportunity there, working the land, that's proper, that's what rural areas are for, land work, agriculture, so if you want to do something like that, that's sort of all right. And similarly, there was quite a lot of casual work still in agriculture at that time in rural areas, so harvests, planting times, where some of these groups could earn a bit of money and get a bit of experience, of course, of working the land. So, maybe quite a positive picture there in terms of localities. Representations, and you'll see the incredible spring band there, example of these sort of groups. But in terms of representations, well, not really. The back to land idea didn't really fit with the productivist idea of a very modern sort of industrial forms of agriculture. So it was all, you are land workers, but how you imagine working the land is doesn't really fit. Yet it's all about agriculture and cultivation, so that's all good. Third point there is, these people often soon described as hippies, and this idea of the sort of going back to the land, getting back to the countryside. Well, surely this is exactly the sort of thing we want to get rid of. We don't want that. We want a modern countryside. We want a modern sort of industry there. So we don't want this sort of anachronistic sort of return to the land. In terms of the lives, maybe not lived by them, but by other back to land experiments, let's think about that. Well, one of the things I've argued there was very much stress was this. There was a sort of sense that the urban and rural were very separate. There's a real sort of an ideological idea that, you get to the countryside, it's completely sort of different at this time. There's going to be a completely different, we can create a different world there because it's a different type of space. In other words, there's a strong emphasis in the lives of actually just being in the rural as being the key thing. Maybe not thinking through what you're actually going to do there and just getting into that rural. So it's a sort of spatial fix, you might say in geographers' terms. Also, their lives were often quite introverted in the sense they were very much about doing their own little thing, not interacting, not connecting with surrounding communities. Very inexperienced in terms of urban residents and sort of the 60s counterculture, had no really experience of working the land or what have you. And there were, at the time, although there were people like John Seymour, of course, but there weren't that many sort of precursors. There wasn't much prefiguration. You could there weren't many sort of you can network with when you got there to sort of show you the ropes, so to speak. And so we can sort of summarise all that. It was very much about sort of dropping out. That seemed to be the sort of key thing, and the actual practicalities of doing that were problematic for the. So it didn't look too good for this sort of trial by space in that sense. Now let's compare that to the present day there. That's okay. And this now the context is what at least some of us would call, though it's a contentious term, the post-productivist countryside. And this is a period where the date of when it started is very much up to dispute. But let's just say you might see it today in the 21st century at least. It's the idea now that the rural, this singular model of rural as dominated by more agriculture, more sort of industrial, mechanical forms of agriculture is displaced, by a sense of the rural as a much more diverse space for much more diverse interests. That clearly includes the sort of post-war style productivist agriculture, as we'll see in a second, and more extreme versions of that. But it also includes other types of agriculture and also other types of uses, particularly consumption uses. So that growth of in-migrants, counter-urbanisation to rural areas is absolutely fundamental today to what the countryside's about, rightly or wrongly. Leisure is a key leisure resource, of course, widely recognised and marketed thus, heritage site, etc. So a very different overall spatial context to what we saw in, say, the 1970s there. So thinking about the sort of localities now, the barriers and opportunities again. Now here, in terms of migration, it's not drift from the land, or still out-migration, of course, going on, we'll talk about that, but in-migration is very much a sort of normal part of the rural sort of localities. You measure people moving in. It'll be, if you're profiling rural areas today, that's one of the key things you're going to do to sort of mark out a rural place. And, well, is it making the countryside more diverse and less diverse? More diverse in some ways, maybe, in terms of where people were brought up, origins. But, of course, there's a huge debate about the countryside becoming extremely undiverse in terms of class and things like that, becoming increasingly sort of gentrified in that sort of sense. So there's a sort of a bit of a mixed picture there as to quite how that fits with the sort of back to land potential community approach. This time, though it's not wide, land is more available, relatively speaking, I would say, than houses. Houses have been now, those that were left were taken up, gentrified, very, very expensive. So purchasing a house in a rural area is like, you have to really win the lottery, basically, unless you're in a very high-paid job to do that. So it's very difficult in that sense. So obviously that's fed into things like the growth of low-impact developments and self-build and sort of eco-home type developments. So it's not all bad in that sense. In terms of the type of agriculture shaping rural areas, it's recognised that industrial agriculture or industrial-style agriculture is not the only way thing there, and it's not the only way forward. It's much more diverse forms of agriculture. But on the other hand, there's a rise of what I've called elsewhere super productivism, which is a really hardcore, very much intensive form of productivist agriculture and the landscapes that go with it. You very much see that in parts of East Anglia, East Midlands, that sort of area, and sort of Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire mentioned a lot today. That sort of area where there's very little space, you might say, for more sort of alternative back to land type approaches. In terms of representations and lives, first of all, representations, representing the land now, the rural now, is very much a place of diversity and diverse land uses. So that sort of is a sort of a positive spatial context. Recognising land work in a sort of more pluriactive way, part-time farming, diversified farms, but also different types of agricultural land working activity seen as having very much a role to play in the sort of the 21st century countryside. Recognising that there are plenty of urban residents in the countryside now. It's a place, again, you can debate, you can make comments on this, but it's now recognised there's a lot of urban influences, and that's in terms of residential influence in the countryside. And also in terms of a lot of these schemes, these attempts, like the ultimate success of something like Lammas in West Wales, the planners, at some degree, or some planners, sympathy with a lot of these experiments and attempts to try to do things a bit differently, to try to work, something like, look at Chapter 7 or something like that, working very well there. On the other hand, there's a big sort of barrier, and that's the sense that the dominant sort of representation of the rural, arguably today, is a very aestheticised one in a particular very sort of idyllic, sort of very manicured, sort of very idealised, sort of very strong sort of aesthetic vision, which again, a lot of the back to land experiments in ways they sort of lay themselves out do not conform to. So that's a bit of a problem there. In terms of lives, this time we've switched the sign around. It is less of a sort of sense that the urban and rural are fundamentally different. It's much more of a blurring in the lives and lifestyles, I think, of many of the people involved. And here, it's not so much about just moving into the rural as if it's some sort of magic spatial trick that's going to do the business. It's what you do there that counts. So practices are much more sort of highlighted or foregrounded much more. And in that sense, it ties in with all these other points here. In the sense, they're much more sort of extrovert in one sense. A lot of outward orientation, a lot of contemporary schemes. We see this, and it's been mentioned by Jenny already, in their educational role. They often play, trying to bring in local people and children to show them, we're not some sort of dangerous sort of cult. We're actually doing some very interesting things here, and can maybe learn from this, from sort of greener, sustainable lifestyles, that sort of thing. And that's often based on more experience than in the past, and research. There's much more research available, accessible through the internet, that's feeding into the everyday lives of the people involved. And now there are many precursors. These networks are there because, of course, despite what I said about the 70s, many of them did survive. And I've written about West Wales, Wales particularly, how there's sort of a more sort of a network, and that helps to consolidate the current efforts. And there's a challenge there to the sort of the challenging the sort of put there the counter-urban status quo. It's the sort of gentrification of the countryside. There is a sort of a backlash against that, and to some extent you can argue, although they might be seen as part of that, the back to land can also sort of challenge that as well, be part of that sort of challenge to the sort of what I call mainstream counter-urban status quo. Okay, then finally a couple of slides on, well, what does this say about passing the trial by space? How do back to land types of intentional community, do they pass that? Well, if your trial by space is successful, as Andy Merrifield puts it, channeling Lefebvre there, the group and its spatiality needs to become a vital, productive member of the cast. So recognising there it's part of different spatialities, different groups have their own spatiality. If you sort of can hold your own, basically, you have passed the sort of trial by space. And here I'm going to make a final distinction between two types of spatiality according to Lefebvre, diverting space and then producing space on the last slide. Détournement, as he puts it in the French, of course, described by Rob Shields there as readaptation, the hijacking of existing spaces, is, like you might say, one way forward. And we see this very much, certainly in the 70s and in even some more contemporary attempts to try to create sort of back to land type intentional communities. Taking over marginal land, for example, it's just not needed by the sort of the mainstream, using overlooked or bypassed spaces, keeping below the radar for the planners and what have you. But we need to ultimately think, well, that might work for a while, but how sustainable is that? You're sort of having to sort of work, hide and sort of keep it all a bit, not sort of get your attention too much. How long term can it be? How, if you like, essential is the sense of sort of the reproduction going on there? Now, clearly, that idea of détournement has been picked up in many sort of radical currents and seen as a very sort of powerful thing to sort of shake the status quo, the situationists, reclaim the streets, the idea of temporary autonomous zones, Hackenbay's idea, all that sort of stuff. But for Lefebvre, certainly, it was somewhat a sort of limited strategy. Sort of talk about in terms of plants, it's like an sort of exotic species of plant. There's strange and bizarre interventions into the spatial landscape, but maybe not really sustainable, not really going to last. In contrast, and this is the last slide, I know I'm out of time, there's the idea of producing space. And this is the essence of what Lefebvre was all about. It's the idea that you need to create that threefold spatiality that in some way sustains and reproduces itself, and as I've highlighted there, very much in its own terms. That is the challenge. You really have got through your trial by space if you can achieve the production of space. And we might see this in terms, as Noel Longhurst put it based on his PhD down in Totnes, of building a countercultural milieu that sort of helps when we reproduces and supports itself. Obviously, we could look at that critically, I guess. And like I say, I've talked about that bit in the context of rural Wales there. And it's where there's sort of it's quite a sort of quite a challenger to the status quo, quite invasive there. It's a product of political struggle, creating sort of resilient spaces. But finally, though, I'm ashamed to end on a bit of a downer. Well, we'll have a positive point right in the last bit. There are a number of hurdles to this. Of course, there's still, for these particular types of intentional community, degree of discrimination, how you want to put it, from different types of communities. I don't know to name them particularly. There's also issues of insecurity and insecurity in terms of things like planning and land rights, that sort of issue. There's still big hurdles to overcome there. There's a tendency still towards the sort of dropping out, more introverted, I've called it elsewhere, cultish sort of spaces of some of these experimental. I can't remember, I haven't had time to find, I can't remember where I got it from. The idea of countercultural retreat areas has been sort of suggested in the literature by somebody. I'm sorry. Then, on the other hand, there's also the tendency, as well known from sort of more anarchist sort of perspectives, of recuperation, of saying, yeah, well, these are really, these cool sort of radical different ideas, let's take them and market them and turn them into sort of mainstream money-making initiatives, so sort of a more hybridized, recuperated, tamed and negated sort of versions. And you might say that sort of thing happens in some more sort of countercultural areas, but I don't want to name any names, because I get shot down probably. And then finally, a couple more points. Disillusionment, of course. Yeah, there's a huge amount. I mean, I knew my friend Larch Maxey was very much involved with the early days of the Lama scheme, for example, and the amount of bureaucracy and work and research had to go into that. You know, the amount of, it's phenomenal. Great wheelbarrows full of documents and all this sort of stuff. Inertia and bureaucracy went into that. You can obviously create disillusionment very easily, and that overlaps with that final point there. Of course, that these communities are hard work, and no one should ever sort of think they're not. They're not some sort of cop out. Very much an effort to put the work in. So finally, I will though, and on a slightly positive point, what I was trying to say there, I think in many ways, in terms of the trial by space, the context in which trial by space is taking place, I think, although we may have some issues with the terms, they are more likely to sort of be able to pass that in a sort of larger scale in a more post-productivist environment than in the sort of very quite narrow view of what rurality was for, even in the sort of 70s there, in terms of the productivist idea of the rural. So I think there is more scope there, but we need to always be aware of that spatial context in everything we do. Thank you very much.